Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. Lovely autumn day here after a fair bit of rain, and my harvest preparation's been a little bit interrupted by that rain, but I thought I'd come down the old blocks and have a look and see whether any nuts were falling. It looks like we've got our first few nuts, which you would expect in late March. So there are a few nuts coming down from the trees, not enough to get me overly excited, but we still need to prepare these blocks and do what we can. But anyway, we'll keep walking through here as I talk about the main topic, and that is, as I've been talking about lately, the price crash for macadamias. And I've got a few threads to draw together. It's thanks to the Australian Macadamia Society largely, and they've been holding some information sessions and also consultative sessions in largely the Northern Rivers and also central Queensland, that is Bundaberg, talking about what's caused the price crash, when we can expect to get out of it, and what the costs of macadamia growing are, and whether we can limit any of them in the low price environment and try to at least sort of narrow our losses a bit. And it was pretty interesting stuff, some of which you'll have heard before, but there were some new tips that surprised me. I also had the benefit of running them by a local farmers meeting here in Rosebank, where we discussed these very issues, and I got some feedback from people as senior as Peter Fraser, who has been through these price crashes himself. So let's get into that advice. First of all, the state of the industry in terms of marketing. The world industry has managed to increase demand for macadamias year over year at a fairly reliable 6% a year. The problem is macadamia production is going to triple in the next 10 years, and that's a lot more than 6% a year. So we have a problem in that, there'll be more macadamias than the market is expanding by, unless we change the way we market and we open up new markets. And there are some exciting developments in India, where we're finally getting some regulatory approvals through and a free trade agreement to export Australian macadamias to India. Hello to my Indian subscribers. Hopefully you'll be tasting some lovely nuts soon. The total imports into India last year were 3 tonnes. Now, I could have supplied that from Nutkin Farm, and I had a bad year. But the sky's the limit. I mean, it's a large population that loves tree nuts in their cooking, and hopefully they'll start to realise that macadamias are the finest tree nut available. And I can't wait for that. That would solve a lot of demand-based problems if it paid off. And it did pay off in Korea, so let's see if we can pull off the same thing with India. The benchmarking group, which cover, about 2/3 of Australia's production of macadamias, came up with some interesting stats on what it costs to actually produce macadamias. And this is important because you've got to compare it to the price you get. For the Northern Rivers, the average cost of producing macadamias came in at about $7,000 a hectare. In central Queensland, it was more like $9,500 a hectare. Now, you might think the difference between that is irrigation, and it might be partly correct, although the culture in the Queensland industry is very input heavy and has been for many, many years, particularly during the price growth period, where the Queensland industry has grown up in the price growth period. They're spending more habitually than the Northern Rivers crowd do, and they're putting more nutrient into the soil as well, which could partly be explained on the basis that their soils are less fertile and obviously have less water as well. The catches are twofold. One is the stats run out in 2021, and that's before the Ukraine war, before the price rises for fuel and fertiliser shortages and all those sorts of other input costs and just general inflation. So the data is only for 2021. And the second catch is it doesn't include the cost of labour, either your own or employees. It's just the sort of out-of-pocket costs that you spend on the orchard itself. So bear in mind that, if we say it's $9,000 in current terms and your price for macadamias is $1.50 a kilo, you need to make 6 tonnes a hectare before you even break even. That's before you pay yourself. So That's a big ask, really. And I mean, the other catch is that the farms that were making over 4.5 tonnes a hectare, which was the desirable target amount according to the industry, the ones making over 4.5 tonnes a hectare were spending over $10,000 a hectare on that. And there's a direct relationship between how much you spend and how much you produce. So, spending more money to make more nuts can work if the price is okay. If the price isn't okay, what you might end up doing is widening your losses. So all of the advice that follows from now is really not about trying to make a profit. On those maths, you can't. There's just no way to add up those numbers that make you a profit. It's about minimising your losses, preparing yourself for the next price rise. Now, speaking of that, we finally had someone brave enough to make a prediction on when the price for macadamias is next going to go back up. That was Chris Searle, an agronomist who's very well known in the industry. He's been through 3 price crashes before. He's seen it all before. He saw this one coming. He actually saw it coming a year earlier than it did, but he knew it was coming. His view was the prices of macadamias had got too high relative to other nuts, and he knows, and it's a very good point, that macadamias don't just compete against each other. We compete against other nuts as well. There's plenty of ways to add crunch to your food, and while macadamia is the best way, it's not the only way. So he said, look, the price crash was inevitable, but his prediction for the rise is 2025, possibly 2026. That's when he thinks the price is going to bottom out and start climbing back up again. He didn't predict where it's going to end up, but that's sort of where he thinks it's going to happen. Now, down to the actual advice. What to do in the meantime. Pruning. Should you still prune while times are tough? The Northern Rivers farmers who regularly prune their orchards said they were going to cut costs by cutting back on the pruning. These are the ones who prune their trees regularly. I'm not talking about ones that need rehab. The ones that just did pruning as a yearly event said they might skip it down to every 2 years while they're battening down the hatches. Pretty much everyone else said you need to keep pruning because you need light into the trees. You need to keep the trees in good condition, and you want the trees to be at their optimum when the price starts going back up. So failing to prune now means losses down the track. So there was that sort of difference in opinion. If the farm needs severe pruning, which a lot of farms do in the Northern Rivers, Chris Searle's advice was go in there and be ruthless. Cut a lot out of the trees. You're going to be doing them a favour. They'll take a few years to recover, but in those few years you're going to get a crap price anyway. If you have no crop in the trees in those 3 years, you won't need to spray them. It's a benefit in terms of other input costs, and you help solve other problems like root exposure. And also on the fertilising front, you've got a lot of carbon in the wood chip going back into the trees and making your orchard healthier. He made a very good point that particularly in the Northern Rivers, when the prices were good, people resisted pruning, going, look, I don't want to prune and harm my cropping because I'm getting a great price. And then when the price crashes, they've got no money, and then they've got no money to prune. And so there's always an excuse not to prune. He says, look, this time, be ruthless, go in there, chop your trees out, restore the productivity while the prices are low, because your lost crop is not worth anything like what it would be if you were doing the same exercise in a boom. Sounds like good advice to me. His more controversial advice is he said, look, if you're going to prune these trees, just burn the limbs because it's too expensive to chip them. He said it might be a lot cheaper to burn your prunings and then bring in chip from somewhere else. Now that caused a lot of consternation, and Dr. Femi Akinsami, who's an academic in our field, was horrified at that proposal. And look, I don't see myself ever doing that. You just think if you've got the fallen limbs on the property, then chip them up and put them under the tree. It can't be that expensive relative to dragging them away and burning them and then paying someone else to bring chip out. But, Chris's view was do the maths, work out which is the cheaper option. It might be bad for your farm, but it could be essential for your business. And look, that's a very business-like approach, but one that caused, like I said, a bit of angst. Fertilising. Well, we had some differing views here, but not in the Northern Rivers. The Northern Rivers panel all sort of agreed that you might as well just use organic-based fertilisers. And one of the favourite in consensus was just spreading this mulch, which was a mixture of hardwood chip and cow manure. So you're providing fertiliser in the cow manure, that's providing the nitrogen. You're providing a lot of carbon in the wood chip. You're covering over roots, and so long as you apply enough of it, that's all the fertiliser you need, and it lasts a very long time. It can keep feeding over an entire season, rather than granular chemical fertiliser, which is really quite fast release and short term. Chris Searle's view was just use less fertiliser than you've been used to using. Don't dump it on in large quantities, but do it more often. There was a South African consultant, I forget his name, who said you might just want to pare back to a simple, relatively cheap NPK fertiliser. That sounded like a recommendation for granular chemical, but they were pretty much the outliers in the exercise. So there was a lot of favour of just doing organic matter and not feeding anything else unless you needed to supplement trace elements like boron. One lesson from the past crash of 2007 was that some farmers resorted to a product called Easy N. Now you can still get it. It's a fertiliser by Incitec Pivot, and it's a ammonium fertiliser that's something like 40% nitrogen. And so people were putting that on their trees in 2007, and it causes lovely green leafy growth, at least in the short term. But applying that fertiliser, the nitrogen by itself, stripped the soil of trace elements, stripped the soil carbon out, and was absolutely terrible for the trees, even in the medium term. And it's an absolute lesson not to do that as a cost-saving measure. In this particular price crash, yes, you might get some green leaves, but you're only kidding yourself. Moving on to harvesting. There was a consensus now that the previous best practice of the industry, like pick up every 3 weeks, was now a bit of a nonsense, because last year during the rains we all discovered that you could leave nuts on the ground and they could sit there in the rain, in the mud even, and you could pick them up and get amazing quality results despite them being there for a long time. So doing the 3 weekly harvest pickup is a waste of money, and it's one of the best places you can save money is not harvesting any more than you need to. Chris Searle was much more specific. He said, look, if you're not likely to get more than a couple of tonnes a hectare, you're probably better off to leave the nut on the ground and mulch it up. Harvesting always causes some damage to your orchard rows, and so you wouldn't necessarily damage your root exposure and everything like that just to get a crop that wasn't going to pay you money. And under 2 tonnes a hectare, well, you're spending a lot of money, and instead of cutting your losses, you might actually be making them worse. Now, the counter argument was, by the time you harvest, you've already spent 2/3 of the money you're going to spend on producing the crop, so you might as well pick it up. I'm not here to judge which argument is better. I think both have their merits. Chris also mentioned you could do a hybrid of those approaches and say, pick up your first harvest, where you get up all these junk nuts here. See, these are last year's nuts. They're no good, but they'll come up in the first harvest. And you get rid of them. And then he said, spray the trees with Ethereal in April, and it'll bring down all your crop at once, or most of it. And then after you've picked that crop up, don't do any more harvest rounds, because there'll be too little crop left to justify it. Now, Ethereal, for those of you who've never heard the term before, is a hormone. It's used to ripen bananas, pineapples, cloves, lots of even apples to some extent. It's a natural hormone used to make the tree send a signal to its fruits to ripen and drop them. And it's I suppose you could say it's natural in a way. The application of it isn't exactly natural, and others like Peter Fraser wouldn't use Ethereal in a pink fit. He says it's very harmful to the health of the tree, and it often results in macadamias in a lot of lost leaves as well as a lot of lost nuts. So I'm not a fan of it, but Chris Searle said, look, just for your business, again, for your business, not for your orchard, it might be worth using ethanol to drop all your crop and pick it up, and then just don't pick up any more. That's interesting advice. I don't agree with it, but I thought I'd put it in there because that was one of the opinions offered. There were some different views on whether to process nuts on your farm or just put them in the skip, which was been the increasing trend when the prices were high, and get the places like Summerland Farms to do the processing, the dehusking and the quality sorting for you. The problem with outsourcing it is that you end up paying about 50 cents a kilo for dehusking and sorting, and when you're only going to be paid $1.50 for the entire crop, that 50 cents is a third of what you'd get just from their handling of it. And so there are farmers, and some on the northern rivers in particular, who have switched back to using their own processing plants on their farms, their own dehusking machines, using their own labour to sort the nuts out themselves and then send them on to the processor without paying the middleman. The competing view was that, doing that takes a lot of time and a lot of electricity, and you might actually be better off outsourcing that the way we have been recently, and getting the external processors to do it. Definitely they have better equipment than you see on farm. They have state-of-the-art dehuskers, state-of-the-art laser sorters, colour sorters, water sorters, air sorters, and all of which is fairly complex machinery. But just bear in mind it seems, a trend towards going back to sorting and processing on farm. Should you plant new macadamia trees? So on that issue of planting, a couple of farmers said, nope, we're just battening down the hatches, no new expenditures, we're not going to do that. And the same applies to things like new machinery, new major investments in sort of farm technology. That's really not going to happen much. Look, Chris Searle said, great time to plant new trees because, if you're planting the new precocious varieties like MCT1, they'll be cropping by the time the price comes back up. And lucky little you, they'll be coming online just in time for the next price rise. So he says it's a good time to plant. That's, I guess, an argument, but you don't see too many new plantings now where the trees are just going in. So perhaps the consensus in terms of what people are doing rather than what they're saying is that the new plantings aren't really going in at the moment. And finally, crop protection. What do we do in terms of spraying? One of the Northern Rivers farmers said, look, last year I sprayed for fruit spotting bug. I used a product called Transform. It cost $1,300 for a 5-litre bottle of that spray product, and I can spend $180, get a 5-litre container of Bulldog and get the same effect. It's got the same application rates even. $180 versus $1,300. It seems like a no-brainer. Now, Bulldog isn't as good on one argument, although it seems it's quite good on fruit spotting bug. It can cause other pests to crop up, like mites. But when it's that much of a price difference, a return to that cheaper chemistry, and that's something that Nick Savage says he's doing, a return to that cheaper chemistry is probably where a lot of farmers are going to go. So the new latest thing in terms of technology and chemicals is probably going to give way to what gives you the most bang for the buck. Hopefully that doesn't result in farmers going back to diazinon and the really heavy organophosphates. It can't be argued about their effectiveness. They're effective, all right. They'll kill everything, including you. But, you just hope that people don't go too far down that road. As for mowing, less versus more. Well, the consensus is that you should leave your farm looking a bit more like this until it's ready to actually pick up a harvest. And if you're not picking up a harvest, you don't even need to bother then. That we mow too much. There's too much vanity involved in it. People like nice, neat, mowed rows of macadamia trees, and I agree, there's nothing prettier. But when it comes to saving money, you use up a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of diesel mowing your farm, and there really needs to be a better reason than vanity for you to do it. So the counter argument to that is also a crop protection measure, and that is rats. Rats can hide in long grass. They can hide a bit better than they can in mown grass, and if you're relying on owls to do a lot of your pest control, as I do, then mowing is actually a collateral benefit for that level of pest control. Depends on a few things, I suppose. One is how much of a problem are rats. Certainly the argument raised by the consultants was you don't want to ignore any rat problem that you do have, because you don't want to build up populations, and then when the price goes back up, the rats are eating what is again a very valuable crop. And rats do, increase in numbers over time if you don't do something about them or you don't have some strategy. The rest of it sort of depends. If you're in an intensive macadamia farming district and there's no rainforest around and nowhere for owls to live, you'd need to do things like baiting, because you've just got very few other predators for the rats. Thankfully here at Nutkin we don't have a big rat problem, but one could develop over time. So on balance I'm going to be mowing when it's safe and economical to do so, but otherwise you look at obviously the bottom line very closely. But the final point, and yes, thank you for watching this long, guys. I realise it's a long video, but the final point was what one of the elderly farmers said. Look, in the last price crash, there was a lot of anger and there was a lot of blame. People were looking for scapegoats. People were looking for reasons why we're in this mess. And his advice was pretty good. He said, look, the anger didn't improve our prices by 1 cent. Right? Said you're running a business, not a religion. The sooner you get over the price situation that we're facing, the sooner you can get on towards addressing it and preparing yourself for the next good times. And there's no point wasting your energy being angry. And on a lovely day like this, I must say I agree with him. Thanks for watching this advice, guys. I do hope it helps some of you in your decision making on how you navigate these tough times ahead. I will be with you all the way and look forward to talking with you again very soon. Bye for now.